Hello, everyone, and welcome to July 2026 Integration Down Under. We've got our organizers, Martin and Dan, Mick, Wagner, and myself. And tonight we have Wagner talking about the Logic Apps Standard SDK. And for most people, that means the codeful approach to building Logic App Standard. And one of the big takeaways I had from it, from seeing his talk at Integrate, was the fact that you've got all of that same run history. It shows you the shapes that you've created in the Codeful experience, but it gives you that run history, which I thought was very impressive. So without too much further ado, we will hand over to Wagner. Let me just take my slides off and add his to the stage. And
Thanks, Bill.
Thank
Yes,
you.
I'm not on mute. I thought that I could be on mute. So, hey everyone, it's been a while. I think it's like last year that I presented something. I can remember, but it's definitely been a while. So good to be back. So, as Bill was saying, today we're going to be talking about Logic Apps Standard SDK, right? So, it's a way to write workflows using C# instead of JSON. And for people that doesn't know me, I'm Wagner Silveira. I'm the principal product manager on Logic Apps. I look after developer experience, and I'm the PM working on this project. But I also look after the community. So you can find me on Logic Apps Live, and usually creating the newsletter every month. That, by the way, this month highlighted Bill as the Logic Apps Aviator of July, right? More than deserved.
Thank you for that.
No worries, man. So before we go and deep dive on the SDK, right? Let's talk about what is that SDK? What is the workflow that we're talking here? So a lot of people before kind of loves how Logic Apps works. They like the concepts of connectors. They like the concepts of having a workflow engine that you can visualize as a graph instead of just lines of code. But they either starting to get trouble with Logic Apps when or the workflow becomes too complex, and then because of that, what is really an advantage from visualization becomes kind of a problem when we altering, because your workflow becomes too big and it's really hard to find where you are on the workflow. That is not such a problem during operation because you can follow the breadcrumbs, but during altering is can become a problem. The other set of people that was looking for something like what we're doing here now was people that already have a group of .NET developers, and those group of .NET developers are actually the responsible for implementing everything on the organization, including integration. Then they would kind of having to work in two different ways. Applications, microservices, everything was done in code. Then workflow integration or integration using workflows has to be done with a visual tool, right? So the idea here is providing you with the same definitions and the same way to implement a workflow, thinking about a workflow, but now using code for that. So you bridge the gap for people that only have that .NET bench that they needed to use, and also for those people that can starting to group their workflows in components, and then because of that make it simpler for creation in a way that's reusable, right? The other thing that is like a lot of people was asking is, even though coding agents like GitHub Copilot or Cloud Code became a lot easier to manage things that are not necessarily imperative code like JSON and things like that, they still work really well with code. So having an SDK and having documentation that explains how that SDK works, make it easier for you to actually use code for that. Use code agents for that. So now that we discussed like why, let's see what it is. So as I said before, Logic Apps SDK is basically a new package that gives you a fluent code first way to build Logic Apps standard workflows, right? Using C# as a language. So you compose your workflow by chaining trigger and actions together, right? But all of that is using domain-specific language inside that is spread as a Fluent API. The most important thing here probably is to say that this is a new way to alter, not a new runtime. Both the workflows running using the Logic Apps SDK and the workflows running using the JSON and workflow definition language are running under the same Logic Apps Standard SDK runtime, right? Which means that from an operational point of view, they behave the same. And that is probably one of the advantages that you're going to see later. So now, for that people that has that always wanted to have a bit more control, your workflow behaves like the rest of your code, right? So some of the advantage that you have is like now you have type safety, you have IntelliSense out of the box. Like you can actually start writing your actions, your triggers, and the IntelliSense pick up and find the information for you. Like things that you usually would be doing in a .NET IDE, like refactoring, debugging with F5, using like some of the other .NET ecosystem components that you might want it, is available. And although we already have that available with custom code, now we needed to switch environments. You are actually in a single surface where you can define your workflows and also define the extension code that you want. The other thing is like, although Logic Apps can be source controlled, right? It's one of the things that a lot of people complained or that a lot of people that notice is the way that JSON behaves can be a burden when you needed to do diffs or when you needed to do review of that code, because sometimes one line of that or changing one element readjusts the whole JSON, while code is a lot more predictable on how is going to work, right? It stays on the same, so you know exactly what you edited, what you removed, or what you change. So it's easier to do diff, and because of that, it's easy to review your changes. As I said before, because you have access to the .NET ecosystem and you're working on the same surface, extensibility is a lot simpler. You can compose your workflows, and when you needed a special component that is to extend that workflow, you can simply create a method and call that inside the same surface that you're doing that, instead of creating the workflows in creating the extension in a new project, compile, bring it in, and then open the designer to load that, right? Everything happens in the same place. And the other thing, although is not necessarily one of the first reasons to use it, but people that is using agentic workflows with Logic Apps can still use the same SDK of people that is creating enterprise integration workflows, right? So the setup for that is exactly the same. So both of them works the same way. So let's take a little bit of a look of how a project looks like here. And then from here, we can go explore that on Visual Studio Code. And after that, I can come back and discuss the code with you. So the way that you create a new workflow is the same way that you would be creating any other Logic Apps workspace. You go create a new workspace, then you define the type of project that you add into that workspace, and now you have a new project called Codeful. After that, you can go and define the type of workflow that you want. You enable your connectors, and you're ready to edit or to run. The basic components that it adds that are different from what you had before are 2 new files, right? Which is the program.cs. That basically defines how we're going to start that host. So that is similar to what host.json would be before, in a way, right? Is the configuration on how that would be defined. And each workflow now is a workflow.cs file instead of a folder with a workflow.json file inside. You still have your connection.json, you still have your local settings. To be honest, you still have your parameters and other files like that. But once you run this, they behave exactly the same as a workflow that would be created visually. So assuming that my machine is behaving, because up to, I think, 22 seconds, right, Bill, before we started, it was giving me some trouble. Let's take a look at how it looks, right? We can explore the code. If everything goes according to plan, we can go and build this, and then from there we can discuss a bit more about the components. So let's see how things are looking here. Okay, so seems like it started, right? The first thing I'm going to show you, and I'm not going through the whole process just because my machine is a bit slow today, but to show how this would work is, as I said, the same place where you have the other projects and the other workspace before. You can go to create new Logic Apps workspace. And when you click on that, it opens a new wizard, right? So this is not specific for Codeful workflows, but that's something that we did to improve a little bit that the initial onboarding process. So from here, you can define where your workspace folder is going to be created, right? And that is something that caused confusion to a lot of people before. So we decided to put it here and present how it's actually going to be creating even before you complete, right? So in my case, I always put my files in CDEV. So I can browse, and it's going to open my folder here, right? So I can go to CDEV, and this is where I have all my projects, right? But I can simply type, and that makes life easier. I can give the workspace name, name for that workspace, that it could be integration down under. And then when you do that, you actually see exactly where this is going to be created. So this is the parent folder. Integration down under is going to create in a folder for that and create a file called integration.under.code workspace. And this is actually your workspace file, right? Then you go and give the name of your Logic Apps project. I usually call my logic apps. And here is the place where things can go different. You can still create a visual workflow if you select Logic Apps Standard. Logic Apps Standard. You can create the new Codeful project if you click in Logic Apps Codeful. You can click on Logic Apps with custom code, and that is going to give you the previous project where you have a Visual Logic Apps plus the custom code project, or Logic Apps plus Rules Engine, right? So you have access to everything, but in our case, we're going to be creating a Logic Apps Codeful. And then the last thing that you do is give the name of the workflow, right? And select the workflow type. So Codeful supports stateful, autonomous, and conversational engines for now. When everything is fine, it validates everything. You can click on next, and then you can see here like exactly what they're going to create. If I click on create workspace, it goes and creates. But instead of doing that and waiting it for load all the extensions, loading the components, etc., what I'm gonna do is simply show something that I already have created. So let's start looking at how that first workflow looks like. So when you create that workflow, it's going to be looking like this, right? So you have basically a boilerplate project. So every workflow is going to be created first looking like that. Here you have a trigger, right? And that's how you define the trigger. Here I have a connector, like actually a connector action, current wearer under the MSN wearer connector, which is a managed connector in this case. Then I'm creating a response. And finally, that I have all of those components, how they look in the workflow, right? So that is where we having that Fluent API. In this case here, I have a trigger, then I call the current wearer, then I send the response. And with that, you can see that I create in a sequential workflow, but there is other ways that can create a workflow, and I'll show some of the examples later. Then finally, I return that workflow. So this is how the workflow, a basic workflow looks like. Bill, then any questions so far?
No.
Cool. Then I created one or more workflows, and then you have a program.cs file, right? So what that program.cs file is basically putting together how that host is going to be selecting the workflows and run, right? So again, this is boilerplate, right? It looks like a factory pattern here, where I have a host builder, get the worker defaults, then I get the configuration of the services, my workflow factory, and then I load pretty much all the workflows from that assembly. But I could have like add workflows from an array of workflows, or I could have it pointing to a specific assembly. If I have different projects here, I could like add, for example, my shared workflows and then my specific workflow. And with that, you would be having all of that on the project, even though they were created in different projects, right, or in different DLLs. But instead of looking at that one, let's take a look at something that is a bit more complex, right? So that workflow here is similar to that one, where I still have a create workflow, And then just to show you a bit of that, let me if I remember correctly, comment. No. I'll do it wrong, the old way. So I'll just put this. So if I have my trigger workflow triggers dot, and then I have built-in or managed, right? So built-in are like all those are the out of the box HTTP recurrence, right? So if I select built-in, you can see I have a conversational trigger, HTTP trigger, a recurrence trigger. Or if I use managed, then I go and select a specific any specific connector like service bus, right? And then from here, give the name of the reference. And then after that, here is the list of the list of the triggers that the Service Bus connector has, right? So just to give an example of how IntelliSense would work, let me come back to this so I don't destroy my project. So in this case, I have my create workflow that has a name, has a method, has a JSON schema, and a relative path that if you remember how that looks like in the request trigger on the visual design is exactly the same kind of the inputs that you have for that. On mine, I actually passed a object, right? So a JSON object with a location. Then after that, I have another element where I actually creating my variable. So using the initialize variable, calling it location, initializing with empty, and giving it a name. The third thing that I'm doing is I defining a condition, and a condition has an expression, has a branch if it's true, and a branch if it's false, right? And in my case, my expression is if my location is Auckland, then set a variable to Auckland, New Zealand.
Can you zoom in on that a little bit?
Sure. Better?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. So coming back right to that, as I said, our condition has an expression, the true branch, and the false branch. So my expression is if location is Auckland, then set my variable location to Auckland, New Zealand. Otherwise, set my location to whatever you had there in the location body. Then I complete that with location. So notice that here, I'm actually creating one variable action. Set variable action. Here, I'm setting the second set variable action. So that means that if you're looking at that code later, it's going to be looking like a condition with elements on each one of them. I creating my MSNware connection and passing my variable, right, as the input, calling it get current where. And here is a really good place to look at, because I'm actually now using a connection, how do I actually define Sorry, now that I'm using a proper connector, right, and a connector action, how do I define connections on this? You can see that when we start the project, it actually loaded the SDK and an LSP server. So this indicates that we loaded the LSP server for Logic Apps SDK. And you can see that with that, it started to include this the ability to create connections directly from the code. So if I click on the current weather, it's actually going to load my connections, right? And all of that is defined like the same way that would be doing before. I define it my Azure connections. It goes to my it goes to a specific place in Azure, all of that. So you don't lose any of that, right? And you can select one of the connections that exist, so we can create new, right? That I already have connections here, so I don't going to create that again.
Yeah, that was one of the things that caught me. I didn't notice that little thing that said create connection above there when
Yeah,
I went into it. And
and
I had to go in and create the connection.
if you don't notice that, then that means that you probably would be trying to create in the connection manually, and there is no real way to create connections manually for that, right?
Yeah.
Like you
Well,
have to go and create it using ARM or something like this, or use something that you asked. So
and then
this is like the kind of the bridge between the things that we still needed to do visually, at least for now, right? And and the rest of the code.
yeah, and the other thing I ran into was I tried to use the managed identity, and
Mhm.
that didn't work in Visual Studio Code.
Yeah, so that one we are actually we have this in pretty much code complete. So I'll be doing some testing next week on that. We already had like one component that would allow you to at least use managed identity to connect between the application and the application and the connector, right? But that had an issue with a latest version of the MSOL library, which is the one that uses the Azure default credentials. So we found the problem. We created the updates. So next version of the bundle is going to have that support, and I'm going to be talking about that in the next month or so. So managed identity for local is coming to the Visual Studio Code, and
Good.
works the same way. It works the same way that would be working for other things, right? Is we don't really have managed identity locally. That is a Azure concept, but what it does is falls back to the connected user. And if your user has permission on the resources that you're trying to access, then the application is going to be using it. Does it
Yeah,
make sense?
that kind of follows the same thing they're doing in Visual Studio because
Yeah, and
basically,
that would be doing for functions and things like that.
yeah, because I had to do the same thing. And one of the things with my particular ID, I had so many tenants
Mm-hmm.
connected to it. I had to, when I do local debugging with the kind of that ID, I have to put the tenant ID of which subscriptions I want to use to keep it from just completely failing.
Yeah, because sometimes it tries to either go to a different tenant by default or different subscription by default, so it's kind of painful.
Yep.
But that's coming and is using that same Azure default credentials pattern that we saw.
Very good.
So finally, before we try to run this, and let's cross fingers if if I burn enough USB drives to the demo gods today. But the last thing that you have here is I'm creating a response okay, right? And a response and a bad request in case of failure. But up to now, what you see here was me defining actions. How does those actions relate to each other, right? When you're doing that in the visual code, you actually do it all in one go. You create something, and then after that, you create the next one that runs after that, and you're creating the one that runs after that, etc., etc. In here, you just define a bunch of connectors or actions, and now you can define your workflow definition is actually basically those two lines. Everything else is just definition of the code, which means that in some cases, you could have those items created somewhere else, or maybe if you have something that repeats across a lot of workflows, you could have that as a package that you load, right? So you don't, and if you change it on that package, it would be changing everywhere. This is one of the advantages that you have now with code.
But yeah, I've got some logging blocks that I use all over the place.
Login before, login after, and exactly the same every time is always taking in consideration a set of parameters that you always have. Right? So we can now really encapsulate that and share across. I'll be working on some examples of that, so I can share that some of those later. But the way that we're trying to expose that the actual definition of the workflow chain is by using a Fluent API, right? So we're trying to use verbs or the names that kind of tell you what is happening, like you would be speaking in a way, right? So in my case here, I have my trigger, then my location variable, then my condition, then my current weathered action. All of that is sequential, so it's fine. But notice that here is I only created the condition as an action because I put all the condition logic here. So now it's much easier to see the workflow, how it's going to be looking like, because the complexity of the condition is somewhere else. Then now I have my split actions, right? I have to run success. So I have to run response okay if the workflow runs normally. And I have to run the bad request and the workflow hits one of those states. So if you look at the 10, then has kind of some overloads, right? It allows you to do either the response okay, so the action, or the chainable nodes, so a list of the actions together, or an action and a set of flow statuses. So what is the flow status in this case? It is my enumeration of my run afters, right? By default, I don't need it to do flow status dot succeeded because that is the default. So you don't have to say that. But if you needed to define other states, then in my case here, I have the failed and the timeout. That's usually what you would be adding to that, right? And with my workflow defined, I simply return that definition with the name. Does it make sense so far?
Yes.
Yeah. So Let's close that because I actually didn't make any changes. And now let's try to debug this. If everything is working fine, if I click on F5, it's just going to go and start the debug. Right, and what it's going to be doing here is going to do a clean, then is going to be do a build and restoring components. Then after that, when it completes the build, then is going to be the starting the function host. So I have a couple of warnings, which is okay. It managed to build, right? It created the logicapps.dll file. And now is running the func.exe. And hopefully all my bundles are up to date and everything is going to work fine. It's okay, it built. Let's see if it's going to connect the there we go. I'm on debug mode. Okay, so let's close all of that so we can get some real state. How do I see my my set of workflows? Like what is the overview the overview thing here? Like before, you would go to every one of the workflows and click on overview, right? But now you have the on program.cs, you have one overview page. And then when it loads, it's going to be loading the overview, and you have like a single place to see all of them. So here I have all my different workflows, right? And each one of the workflows show it is succeeded or not, but then you have like a single pane instead of going to each one of those. And here my integrate sample, right, is like the last time that it runs was in 26th of June. Let's take a look and try to run this one. Where is my tests? Is here. I have a test file. And there we go. I'm going to click on the send request. And it returned with 200, saying that the current weather in Auckland is 11 degrees Celsius. So accurate, right? Let's look at how that look like. So here we go. Today at 7:38 p.m., which is like my local time. The result of that is pretty much the same workflow definition that we had before.
This is the part that I like because you still got that visual sense of what happened.
That's why we departed from the idea of doing this a lot more C# core based on durable functions, because the first feedback that we got from customers was, I wanted to be able to define my workflows in code, but I want the operational goodness that the Logic Apps gives me. And for me, the operational goodness is be able to resubmit, be able to see the run history, be able to actually, when I select one of those items, see what happened with that workflow or with that action. So on that one, we can actually go and do a comparison with the actual code that created and see if like it worked exactly as we expected, right? So let's close this. So the first thing that we have here was a create HTTP action, right? Call when an HTTP request is received. There we go. That has a particular schema, which is here, right? Then after that, we initialize a variable. Here is your initialized variable with a value empty. Then I had a condition, and my condition was if location is Auckland, and it's actually expression got to true. So because of that, it came to set location to Auckland. And that one, although exists here because we defined, has been skipped as we expected. Get current weather, right? Send like everything. And here is all the values that it returned. Then after that, give me a response okay with this value. But one thing that I actually didn't show you how was this value defined, right? When you're looking at the get response okay, what I have here is the current value in location.value.string, which is my location variable value, is get current action dot body dot responses dot weather dot current dot temperature. So this is actually the output body. If I go to the this value here, for example, it shows like all the values that current has, right? Which matches this that matches this weather dot current dot all the values that you have. So you can actually that's probably the other big advantage when you're creating connection actions. You actually have the IntelliSense to go to that, unless your the action only give you like a raw JSON, and then in that you still will be able to do something similar to what we do here, right? So you
Yep.
have access to all of that, really well defined. So this is the demo, and thanks. Seems like the like burning some USBs was worth. Let's go back and take a look at what are some of the things that I hinted here, but actually that you can have access, right? So the first one is, as I said before, you have the ability to do compose your workflow with two components, right? The basic components for that is then, and then allow you to do one of two things: either create a sequence and create blocks. So the important thing to understand here is that chain can start kind of anywhere, right? Because what you're doing is creating chains of nodes. So in my case here, I have a trigger, then a validate order, then a get order, then a response. But I could have like validate order, then get orders, or something like that. And then after that, I could have trigger, then that chain that put together, right? So this allow you to do something like this. I could go and create two parallel branches, one that has a left chain that has validate order, get orders, and summarize order. Then I could have a right chain that has uh, get users, validate users, then summarize users. And then the way that you join this is using the left chain, join, right chain. After that, you can continue workflow, right? This is similar to what you're doing is creating parallel branches, and then after that, bringing them together. Does that make sense?
Yep.
The other thing that you can also do here on that Fluent UX is be able to use all the same workflow controls that you have available, right? So you have your conditions, you have your for eaches, you have your switch, you have your until, you have your scope and terminate. All of that is under built-in.control. And each one of them shows exactly how it works. You most of the times you're going to have a condition or you're going to have an expression. Then you're going to have what you are allowed to do on that, right? So, for example, on my condition, because I have two branches, I have this expression, then the true branch, and then the false branch. On my for each, I don't have an expression, but I have a list of items that are going to iterate. So I have items. Then I have the actions that happens on each individual item. And here I can have, like, again, a sequence of components. That same thing would happen with switch, would happen with until, etc. And the way that you define how we're going to compose those things is actually using the run after, as I showed before, right? If you wanted to run it after a failure, you use the then and a failed or timeout. Where if you wanted to run after succeeded, either you compose it directly, or if you wanted, you could compose with succeed, flow status.succeed. The other thing to take in consideration here is that by the time of GA, you're going to have access to the full connector catalog, right? Right now, you have built-in connectors, which is your HTTP request, your recurrence, all the three triggers, right? The request, the recurrence, and the conventional trigger. The compose, the HTTP, the response, and the custom code. I actually didn't show custom code, but I can at least show more or less how it would work. Then you have your managed connectors, right? Service Bus, SharePoint, the other ones. And all of that is available today. And you find that just going to workflow triggers or workflow actions, then the namespace of those components. So it's easier for you to find. And the other reason for that is because I can have my service bus managed connector and my service bus built-in connector. We really discuss about only giving one option here, but we wanted to bring parity to what we have today. So instead of saying if I have a service provider connector, I don't give you the managed. We just split them on based on the namespace. Service provider connectors are in actual development, and it's going to be one of the items that we're going to be using for GA. The other one is the support for managed identity, which is going to be coming not just for that. It's actually a runtime feature, so that means that it's going to work both for the Codeful and for the visual. And one of the items that is still working on as well is dynamic schemas, like how it's going to work. Today is you probably would be able to use it, but just with a lot of support that you have today on the actions. But we're working to bring that to GA as well. So when I say dynamic schemas, it's things like when at design time or at altering connectors like Salesforce or connectors like Dataverse, where you select the entity and automatically has access to the inputs and outputs. This is the kind of stuff that we'll try to support with the dynamic schemas. So to close here is when you're looking at the add extensibility to your workflow. This is where the custom code action works. So the custom code action here works just like the inline C# or the local functions that you had before, right? It's going to be running inside the same runtime on the .NET worker for that, but on this you're able to use it in one or two ways. Either you can define a Lambda expression, right? So you can drop the code directly inside of the built-in code, or, which I think is even more interesting, is you can actually have a method that matches the signature that you're passing, and then use that inside the call that inside of the custom code. From a deployment point of view, the deployment works the same way that we would have for the application. After it builds, I think we were discussing that before the build.
Yeah.
After all of that is built, you have a library where you have that code pool, and inside this, you actually have the application, right? So you have like that logicapps.dll, and that logicapps.dll is what is actually used to define to define the workflows. So when the runtime runs and identify that this is a codeful project, and you find that because what is it? Because you have a local settings for that, right? When it defines that, it's going to be looking for that logic apps DLL, and it's going to be the load the workflow definitions out of that DLL. So there is some process that happens behind the scenes that converts the workflow definitions that we generate in each one of the files. So this, right, that is loaded into the host in here into actual JSON representation of what we have. The only difference that you're going to have between this workflow running in Azure after you deploy and a workflow that you create in using Visual is that because that is being altered from an SDK, you passing that from that DLL file, right? So you still be able to see the workflow even in design mode. You don't need to run it to see the definition, but you're only going to see it in read-only. It's not going to be you'll not be able to open in Designer, change, and all of a sudden you have a new workflow there, right? For you to make changes in your workflow, you have to go back to your source of truth, that is C#, make the changes there, and either redeploy or push to your source control for your CI/CD deploys. So that's the content that I had for today, right? You can find We have an announcement block that goes through most of the things that I discussed here. We have some other examples of the components. The how-to that shows that process from create a workspace all the way to debug. And I think the one that is the most interesting from those three is the actual SDK reference. So if you go to, let me just open quickly here. If you go to aka.ms/lastdk/blog, this is the this is the blog that I'm pointing there, that basically shows you like what we discussed, show the definitions and some examples on how it works. But the one that I think is most interesting is that, which is actually, you have that whole SDK available here, right? And shows like all the components that are available, how it works, and if you go to any of those interfaces or any of the definitions, you're going to find inputs, usage, how it works, like all the information about it. So if you think about it, with MS-Learn MCP that points to that, and at least one example of how one of those workflows work with, you could actually point in GitHub Copilot to a definition of a workflow or a problem, and it could be able to get really close to create the workflow in first go. Actually, this workflow here, to prove the point, I created like that. I gave the workflow definition, like here is what I wanted to do, and GitHub Copilot create that definition for me. You can see that it's a lot more commented than if I was going to be writing anything. And that's it for me.
Okay, thank
you. How are environment parameters handled? Is it the same way?
Yeah, parameters works the same way. And let me see if it's here then, but I think it is.
Oh,
Okay,
hold on.
I don't think I'm not sharing anymore.
If I come to...
I'll add it back.
I think that is here. Let's see if it's here. If it's not, I'll find it to you from where the parameters are, or if it's just using the environment. I'll find it for you, but parameters would work the same way.
Okay.
And in this case, you would also be able to actually use, if using app settings, you could use like the C# primitive for that.
Okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to wire up app config the same way you do in functions.
I giving that to the powers that be, because I think it's been a request that's been running for some time. So I'll raise with the team for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I do have to run because I've got some dogs to take for a swim.
They are on the swimming class?
Yep, they do a half-hour swim at a dog pool.
Uh-huh.
So
they do more than me from exercise point of view, man.
Yep. So thank you very much for that, and I think that it's going to open up some interesting things.
I think so too.
and I think one of the things we'll have to do with Copilot is to take a existing JSON workflow and convert it to Codeful.
Yeah, I think that is super doable because like I already was able to read the workflows of JSON and create unit tests for it. So interpreting and understanding the workflow, like that set of skills that I shared like a while ago, where you can go get workflow, understand the workflow, and create test cases for that. It would be the same problem, right? It's like get workflow, understand that, then generate the C# code for that.
Yep. So that would be good. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
We do have to go. And until next time, whenever you're ready to present again, you don't have to wait a year this time.
No, I think it's not next month, but maybe month after. We can talk about Connect on Namespace, which is kind of the flip of that one.
That'll be good. Anything from you, Dan?
Thanks, Dan. See you later, mate.